I use podcasts for a lot of things. I use them to keep up with the day's news, to be entertained while folding the 1,000th load of laundry, and to keep my kids entertained while we're on a road trip. But one way that I use podcasts that I might not talk about as much is to help me think deeply and use my brain in a way that I don't usually get to as a stay-at-home mom of little kids. When I listen to this week's podcast, it helps me to stretch my thinking muscles and consider history in new ways. It's called This American President, and it helps you learn about United States history in a way that you may not have in the past. I'm Andy Smiley, the Friendly Podcast Guide. I'm a mom who has used podcasts to fight the boredom and loneliness of motherhood, and now I want to help you find a podcast that can do the same thing for you. It can be overwhelming to try and find a podcast you'll enjoy in the thousands of shows that are out there. That's where I come in. My episodes are short and they answer all of the questions you'll have about the podcast, so you'll know if it's a good fit for you or not. I'm here to help you find a podcast you'll love without wasting your time. Now, let's talk podcasts. The This American President team describes the show like this. This American President delves into the lives and legacies of U.S. presidents through long-form stories and interviews. It will challenge the way you look at American history. The length of each episode is about 45 minutes to an hour. Before we learn more about the vibe of This American President, we're going to take a quick break to talk about my podcast consultations. I've been able to talk to some amazing podcasters about their shows while doing interviews for the Friendly Podcast Guide. And along the way, I've learned so many tips and tricks on how to start a podcast from the hosts I've interviewed and from personal experience. I've talked to those hosts about what made their launch successful and what made it more difficult. And I for sure know what I would do differently if I could go back and launch my show again. And now I want to share my knowledge with you. I'm offering podcast consults, and I have a couple of spots open in the next month. If you need help nailing down your podcast idea, figuring out your niche, or you have any other podcast questions, I would love to work with you to make your show's launch the best it can be. If you're interested in working with me, fill out the intake form in the show notes. I can't wait to make a podcast plan that is tailored to you and your podcast, and will make your launch as smooth and successful as possible. Now we get to hear from Richard Lim, the This American President host, as he talks about why he thinks learning our history is so important for us as citizens of the world. Richard, thank you so much for being on the Friendly Podcast Guide. I cannot wait to talk about your podcast, This American President. But first, before we dive into your show, can you introduce yourself a little bit?
Yeah, so my name is Richard Lim. I am the host of This American President. Basically, I was always that history nerd. If you've ever had a history nerd in your group of friends who always throws in something hopefully interesting about history, usually unsolicited historical information. But I've been reading history since my mom took me to a library since I was 8 years old. I'm originally from California, and I lived in the Washington, D.C. area for many years. Loved seeing all the history out there, but ended up coming back to California. Started the podcast in 2017, and we've done pretty well. I mean, I would say that it's exceeded my personal expectations and led to a lot of great opportunities, but all of it was really just driven by my passion. I had a job about 6 years ago that I wasn't very happy in, and you try to stay sane in those situations, and one of them was to start a history podcast. And it's one of those things where what's the point of learning all this stuff if you couldn't share it with people, and so that's why I started it. But so just Richard Lim, huge history nerd, also loves basketball. I'm married to the most wonderful woman I know. So I'm very blessed, and they all support me in this history nerd passion of mine.
That's awesome. So if you were the history nerd, then I'm the podcast nerd. I in almost every conversation I have with other adults, I somehow work a podcast episode that I recently listened to in. So
nicely done.
You'll be the history nerd and I'll be the podcast nerd. Because
love it.
I totally get that.
I appreciate the owning your passion.
Yes. Well, if you don't, I feel like you slowly go insane. At least life's
too short to not have a passion. So
yes, and to nerd out about it, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, so you're talking about your history love. Let's dive into your podcast. So, what made you want to start your podcast?
Yeah, well, I guess I kind of got into it a little bit, but basically, when I lived in Washington D.C., I had jobs that I loved, and I had jobs that I didn't like, just like anyone else. But the whole time, all the way through, my passion was always history. But yeah, basically, I had a job at one point that I was told I would be doing something related to my skill set, but it really wasn't. And I was miserable, but I had a buddy at the time who listens to a lot of podcasts, just like you.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
And he just has a really good feel for what is interesting and compelling. And he's very familiar with the podcast landscape. He ended up becoming my producer, Michael Neal, and he's been such a big part of this podcast. And he and I basically, at one point, just rented space at a library and borrowed a microphone from a friend. And that's how it happened. So, and then we started getting this response about our podcast. People like it. It's about history, and it's best to not teach it as names and dates. It's best to teach it as stories of people, because that's really all it
Mm-hmm.
is. And who doesn't like a good story? You know, if you don't like history but you like going to the movies, means you like a good story. So all it takes is for someone to convey that story in an interesting way.
Definitely. Yeah. And I've listened to a couple of episodes, and I would say you're very good at getting that story told in an interesting way. So thank you. And I do love history because of the stories. And I think that's an easy way to get your kids hooked on history as well, is to just tell them the cool stories instead of just the names and dates, like you were saying.
Absolutely. Yeah. And thank you for listening.
Definitely. So we're talking about stories and telling those stories. So through telling those stories, what do you want people to get out of your podcast?
That's a great question. So obviously, when you're telling a story, there's some value there in terms of entertainment or amusement. Um, People like having a podcast sometimes in the background just as white noise, or maybe they can get a funny story out of it. But one thing that I'm personally obsessed with is just the concept of wisdom. Wisdom is something that is I think very valuable. It's the way we live our lives. You know, wisdom is something that can improve your life in so many ways, and it's usually hard earned. We go through life and we make mistakes and we get wisdom from that, or we learn from other people. But history, when you think about it, is so full of lessons that can convey wisdom. And one of my favorite quotes is actually, it's not necessarily about history, but it's about reading. And it says that the person who reads lives 1,000 lives, because essentially if you read, you are looking at the world through another person's eyes, and you're looking at something beyond your own experience. And all of us have experiences in life, and we have, in the whole scope of all the experiences and all of what exists in the universe, all of us have a little sliver of experience of that universe, and it's no two are alike. And yet the same laws of nature and the same laws of physics and all those things apply to everyone. So we all are experiencing the same things, and we're all not necessarily the same things, but similar things. And we all can learn from the wisdom that other people provide. But why limit that wisdom just to the people around you? Why not get wisdom from the ages, and as a country, especially our country, which is a republic, which depends on the people making good choices, you need history to be able to make good choices. I'm not saying that history gives you clear-cut answers, but it sure informs you, and it sure helps you, and it sure shows you some things that worked and some things that didn't work, and it tells you the meaning behind things. And so that's really what's all behind all of this, is wisdom and just promoting that. And there's another quote that I love. I think it's history is to a nation the way memory is to a person. A person can't function without memory. It's impossible, right? If you try to function without memory, you're essentially blind. But for a country to not know its history and yet making tough choices without knowing having memory of what's the past, that's just as dangerous. So that's really the goal for myself, to get wisdom for myself and to share that wisdom with others.
Definitely. Okay, so you're talking about sharing and wisdom and learning. Are those words you would use to describe the vibe of your show, or like what other words would you add to describe the vibe?
Yeah, I hope so. A lot of my episodes are interviews where I like to get a story out of the interviewee, but there are also episodes where I just do the speaking and I give the monologue. And essentially, I try to make it as if I'm talking to the person. I don't, I think that's an art that you can get better at, over time. But when I'm in a group of friends, I love saying, "Oh, did you know that XYZ?" Or "Did you know," something usually surprising about history. And I hope that's the vibe I give off in my podcast, the vibe of the "did you know," a sense of intellectual curiosity, a sense of kind of amazement and wonder about history and just the passion. I hope that's the vibe I give off.
Definitely. Yeah. Those are really good words, like wonder and like almost like excitement about history. Like, can you believe this is what happened? Like, let's learn from this almost,
Absolutely. Yeah. Those chance moments that everything could have changed if things have gone different, and the way it impacts all of us. I mean, that kind of stuff, I'm just never going to get over it. And I hope that comes across in the podcast. Enthusiasm, passion. I hope so.
Yes. Passion and enthusiasm for history and learning from it. And yeah, those are great
Exactly.
words. So this is my favorite question. I like to ask hosts what your favorite episode is, but to give you a second to think about it first, will you tell me where can people find you?
Basically, anywhere that you listen to podcasts. If you go to Spotify, we have a website, This American President, you could go there. But if you just go into your podcast app and look up This American President, we'll be there.
Okay, awesome. And do you guys do social media?
We have social media accounts, and we're trying to post more. I know that's a big part of getting the word out. It's always a bandwidth issue because I have a full-time job, and Michael, my producer, has a full-time job, etc. But my wife is really good at that stuff, and so she's actually having me do more of it, and she's having me specifically do book giveaways, because I do have just like any other nerd, I have tons of books that I use for this podcast. I also get books for free from people who I interview. Their publisher will send it over. So I'm trying to get more followers, but also by doing that, also doing this book giveaway, which also helps reduce the book load, because in our house, my wife's a nerd, I'm a nerd. So anyways, there's books we're trying to give away.
Sure, your bookshelves need a little break. It sounds
exactly.
Okay, well, I will make sure to link all of that in the show notes so people can go directly where they want to. But now you're on the spot. What is your favorite episode or couple of episodes? Because I know it's hard to choose just one.
Couple. Okay, I was just going to ask you if I could do two.
Yes.
So my favorite episode, this is so tough because you have different metrics, right? But I'm going to have to go with something that is just something that's personally important to me, because it covers the subject I'm most interested in. Our listeners know that I'm obsessed with George Washington, my favorite historical figure. I know, it's when people say, "Who's your favorite president?" they want to hear someone kind of unique. So it's like, oh, of course, George Washington, but whatever. He's my favorite. This is America. I get to choose my favorite president, right? So it's George Washington. And the thing that always amazed me about him, which is what amazed people around the world, is that he could have stayed in power the rest of his life. He could have been the most powerful man in the United States, but he left power, which is an incredible thing. So I did an episode basically on that story, and it ends with him leaving power, resigning his commission, but it talks about everything that led up to that and how he prevented a potential coup. It talks about how he upheld civilian authority, and it's the reason why today it's part of why we have elections every 2 to 4 years. It all started with that. So that's my favorite. I would have to say the episode that makes me proudest in terms of the guest that I got was because, sometimes the guest kind of shows, oh, wow, they got a great guest.
Totally.
I got Clint Hill, who is the Secret Service agent that was closest to President Kennedy when he was shot.
Wow.
And that was actually how I got interested in presidents in the first place, because there've been all these documentaries about the Kennedy assassination. And when I was a kid, I got hooked on it. And to be able to get Clint Hill, I mean, first of all, he's an American hero. He served our country as a Secret Service agent for years, and a wonderful man. Met him and his wife. His wife is wonderful. And being able to interview him was just an incredible honor. And yeah, I mean, it was just amazing to be able to show his story. And I hoped I showed his story not in a way that kind of rehashes all the usual stuff, because he's had to talk about the assassination so much, but I wanted to showcase his whole story, not just that.
Wow. Yeah, that's awesome. I have not listened to that one yet, and I'm definitely adding it to my list, both of those, because yeah, I think I must be a little bit of a history nerd too, because I'm getting excited about those. So there we go.
That's great. That's great. Join the club. We welcome you.
I'm glad. Because most of my listeners are moms, I like to ask, is your podcast okay for little ears, or is this one that we should have headphones in for?
I would say that yes, I would say that it's we don't have any gratuitous language, vulgarity or anything like that. We don't like to cover explicit topics or anything like that. The only one I would say that you might be a little careful with is that we did a series on the Spanish-American War. And in one of the episodes, and that was a very personal one for me because I'm Filipino, of Filipino descent, proud American, proud person of Filipino descent. And that episode covered the war between the United States and the Philippines. So, the two countries I love most going to war against each other. And
that'd be hard.
In that episode, I got a little bit graphic about how bad the war was. I mean, it was a horrific war.
Definitely. Well, and usually, at least in my experience, if I'm listening to a podcast episode about war, I'm probably going to avoid being around my 6-year-old in general, because I'm not quite ready to answer all of those questions that are bound to come up. And so I think moms will probably get a pretty good idea from the title and the description if it's going to be a good fit. It's mostly, I think it's just nice to know like an overall vibe, which I feel like you gave, just wholesome learning, history, enthusiasm, passion for history. So that's
right.
Great.
Right.
Is there anything that you want to add that we haven't touched on yet?
Yeah, I mean, I'm very grateful to anyone that listens to our podcast. I mean, the fact that anyone would care what I have to say, I mean, or that you would give me an hour of your day to listen, that means a lot. So, and I've been able to enjoy some pretty cool experiences because of the podcast. I mean, I got invited to a few different programs to speak and being able to speak here on this podcast. So yeah, I feel very grateful for that and grateful for the listeners and grateful that you'd have me on.
Well, I am grateful that you were on my show so that I could introduce you and your fabulous show to my listeners. I feel like once I left school and became a stay-at-home mom, it was harder to find opportunities to like push myself intellectually, if that makes sense. And so podcasts are a big way of how I do that now. And I love a podcast that has passion, but I also get to learn still and like push myself and like think about things deeply instead of just like, have I changed the laundry yet? What are we going to eat for lunch? So
sure.
I'm grateful for shows that can help me work my brain still and think deeply when my normal job that is taking care of small children isn't doing it for me. So
it's one of the most convenient. It's such a convenient medium for that.
It really is. It really is. So thank you for what you do and for being on the show. It was delightful to talk to you, and I cannot wait to have all of my listeners tune in and become your listeners because it's a really, really fun podcast and I'm grateful.
Yeah. Thank you. My pleasure. And yeah, this is great. I'm glad I know about your podcast too.
Yeah. Well, me too. Thank you for listening to this episode. If you know someone who could use this American president in their life, will you share this episode with them? Also, if you have the itch to start your own podcast, fill out the intake form in the show notes so I can help you make your podcast dreams come true. Talk to you soon.
And, you know, you could argue more of American history happens under those presidents. I mean, who are the presidents people remember? A handful, right? Maybe like 8 or 9 or 10 at the most.
Yeah.
There's still 30 something other presidents that, you know, I mean, people forget we had 8 years of James Monroe. That's almost twice the amount of time Lincoln was president.